March 14, 1944. Switchboard room. War Department Communications Hub, Billings, Montana. Cordelia May Hutchins inserted the plug into socket 247 and connected the caller to the dispatch office at Fort Peck. 40 calls before lunch. Monotonous work that had turned her fingers into automatons and her ears into filters, letting through only what was necessary for the job. She didn't listen to other people's conversations, not aloud, but she heard backgrounds. Engine roar from the airfield, radio static, the clatter of teletype machines, sounds of wartime Montana, which in 3 years had transformed from cattle ranches into a maze of military installations serving the war effort. The next call came through on line 54K, classified line. Research station number 12, somewhere in the wilderness between Great Falls and the Canadian border. Cordelia switched it through, connecting the call to Washington. And there, in the pause before someone picked up on the other end, she heard background noise. A child crying. Thin, desperate, inconsolable. From there, where according to all documents only 18 adult male personnel were stationed. From a line where no helicopters flew in with families. From a facility where there were no women, no children. Never. Cordelia froze, the plug suspended in her fingers. The crying continued for about 10 seconds, then cut off so abruptly it was as if someone had clamped a hand over the child's mouth. Someone picked up on the other end, and a man's voice reported in an even tone about completion of seasonal operations. She mechanically switched the next call, but that crying still echoed in her ears. Maybe she'd made a mistake. Mixed up the lines? In 18 years working the switchboard, that had never happened once. But people get tired, lose concentration. She checked the log. Line 54K, station 12. Everything correct. No error. Before her shift ended, she connected another 140 calls. Her hands worked by themselves, but her head kept returning to that crying. A child's crying. Frightened. From somewhere in the wilderness where the maps bore the stamp, restricted facility, limited access. That evening at home, over dinner with her husband Vernon Dale, Cordelia was quieter than usual. He worked as a foreman on the dam construction project, came home once every 2 weeks, tired and taciturn. He noticed her pensiveness, asked if she was feeling ill. She lied, said she was just tired. How could she tell her husband about a child crying on a classified line? He'd say she imagined it. That at 41, women start hearing what they want to hear. They had no children. She'd given birth to a stillborn girl in 1938, then 3 miscarriages in a row, and the doctors said not to try anymore. Vernon didn't blame her, but a silence settled between them that neither radio programs nor talk about work could fill. Maybe he was right. Maybe her mind, starving for a child's voice, had simply invented something that wasn't there. But on March 18th, 4 days later, line 54K came alive again. This time, Cordelia was ready. When the call came through, she didn't rush to switch it. She held the plug 2 seconds longer than regulation, and heard it again. This time not crying, but muffled voices. Several children at once. Whispers, fragments of words. It's cold. I want my mama. When are they taking us home? Then a sharp adult male shout, and the line went quiet. Cordelia switched the call, but her hands were trembling. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't fatigue. There were children there. At a restricted facility 300 miles from the nearest settlement. At a station where documents listed only adult male personnel engaged in defense research. Why? What for? And most importantly, where did they come from? During her lunch break, Cordelia went down to the Communications Hub archives. Among dusty folders of wiring diagrams, she found the registration card for line 54K. Station 12 had been activated in 1941. Official designation? Defense Research Operations within the scope of Northwestern Regional Security. Personnel: 18 individuals, rotation every 3 months. Reporting structure: direct to War Department. No mentions of families, childcare facilities, or anything similar. Cordelia copied the station coordinates and the supervisor's name into her notebook. Thaddeus Edmund Waverly. A name that sounded more like a Boston banker than a researcher in the Montana wilderness. By late March, Cordelia understood the pattern. Line 54K was used 3 or 4 times a week, always in the morning hours, always for communication with Washington or the regional command. And almost always in the background you could make out the presence of children. Sometimes crying, sometimes whispers, sometimes just rustling and sounds that small people make when they try to be quiet but don't know how. Cordelia began keeping records. In a small notebook hidden in her purse, she documented the date, time of the call, and what she heard. March 21st, 10:15 a.m. Child's cough, racking, like whooping cough. March 25th, 11:40 a.m. Woman's voice, quiet, soothing. So there wasn't just children there, but also someone adult looking after them. March 28th, 9:20 a.m. Sound like an infant crying. Very young, a few months old. On April 2nd, something happened that transformed Cordelia from observer into someone ready to act. Another call from line 54K. She listened to the background as usual before switching, and heard a child's voice, very clear, almost a shout. "Let us go home! We want our mamas!" Then a blow, heavy and dull, and a sob turning into muffled weeping. A man's voice, cold. __quote_5__. Cordelia jerked the plug so hard she nearly ripped it from the socket. Her co-worker at the switchboard, Margaret Ann, looked at her in surprise but said nothing. Cordelia switched the call and sat staring at the panel of sockets without seeing it. They were hitting children there, keeping them locked up, not letting them outside. What was this? A juvenile detention facility? But those didn't exist like this in America. Criminals' children went to orphanages. They weren't exiled to the wilderness. A children's home? But why at a restricted defense facility? And why with such secrecy measures? That evening, Cordelia did something that could cost her her job and her freedom. She waited until only the night shift remained at the hub, returned under the pretext of a forgotten scarf, and entered the communications supervisor's office. In the personnel files for restricted facilities, she found the file for Station 12. There was more detailed information. The facility had been established in 1941 under direct order from the Assistant Secretary of War. Funding came from a separate line item, directly from Washington. Personnel rotations happened not every 3 months as at regular installations, but every 6 months. And strangest of all, in 3 years of the station's existence, there hadn't been a single case of early rotation. People didn't request to go home ahead of schedule, didn't leave due to illness, didn't file complaints. 18 men sat in the wilderness for 6 months and stayed silent. That was abnormal. Even at the most disciplined installations, there were those who couldn't handle the isolation. Cordelia photographed 2 pages of the document with a small Kodak she carried for family pictures and hurriedly left the building. At home, under the lamp in the corner, she examined the tiny frames through a magnifying glass. The personnel list included researchers, radio operators, mechanics, cooks, all men. But in the special remarks column, 3 surnames had the same notation: medical credentials, pediatrics. Why would defense researchers in the wilderness need 3 pediatricians? Cordelia spent a sleepless night reviewing her notes from the notebook. How many children could be there? From the voices, she could distinguish at least 5, at most 8 or 9, ages, from infant to adolescent. Where did they come from? What happened to their parents? And why were they being kept at a classified station hundreds of miles from civilization? On April 11th, during a quiet midweek shift, the entire hub was operating at reduced capacity. Cordelia used the lull to do what she'd been thinking about for 2 weeks. When a call came from line 54K, she didn't just listen to the background. She connected her headset directly, bypassing the switch. This violated all regulations and could be detected by monitoring equipment, but Cordelia took the risk. In the receiver came a man's voice, familiar, Station Supervisor Waverly. He was talking to someone in Washington about second quarter operations. Cordelia wasn't listening to him. She was listening to the background. There, behind his back, something strange was happening. Children's voices weren't just talking, they were responding in unison, like in a classroom. 12, several voices said together. Correct, a woman's voice responded. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 10, underscore, underscore, a lesson? They were conducting classes there? Cordelia listened more carefully. The woman's voice was young, patient, like a teacher's. But what kind of school was this, where children were kept in isolation and beaten for trying to call for help? Waverly finished his conversation but didn't hang up. Cordelia heard him address someone in the room. Mortimer Walsh, they're making noise during calls again. We need stricter measures. A second man's voice answered indifferently. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 12, underscore, underscore. The children's voices behind the wall went silent so abruptly it was as if they'd all been gagged at once. Cordelia felt nausea rise. Starving children for making noise? What kind of place was this? A concentration camp? But this was America in 1944, fighting against the Nazis. She disconnected the headset with trembling hands and sat through the rest of her shift in a daze. The next 2 weeks, Cordelia tried to find someone she could tell. The police? They'd laugh at her and advise her to stop listening to other people's conversations. The district attorney? They'd tell her classified facilities weren't her jurisdiction and open a case against her for disclosure of secrets. The War Department inspector? They'd launch an investigation against her for slander of government operations. Cordelia realized she was trapped. She knew about a crime but couldn't prove it without admitting she'd violated regulations and listened in on classified lines. Her word against the system, which in 1944 didn't tolerate self-initiated investigations, especially during wartime. On April 28th, she decided to try anyway. She wrote a letter, not to official authorities but to a journalist she knew from church, Horace Pemberton, who worked for the Billings Gazette. In carefully chosen words, not naming the facility or exact location, she described what she'd heard. Children's voices on a line where children shouldn't be. Crying, lessons, punishments. She asked him to investigate, to find out what was really happening at the defense installations in the Northern Territories. She mailed the letter from the post office on the other side of town, not wanting it traced to her work address. 3 days later, Horace called her at work. His voice was tense, almost frightened. Cordelia, we need to talk. Not on the phone. Can you meet after your shift? They met in a diner on the edge of town, far from the hub and her neighborhood. Horace looked like he hadn't slept. Quote 14. Quote, he said quietly. Quote 15. Quote. Cordelia felt something break inside her. Quote 16. Quote. He looked at her with genuine pity. Quote 17. He paused. Quote 18. He leaned forward. Quote 19. She went home that night feeling like she'd aged 10 years. Vernon was there, unusually. He'd been sent back early because of equipment failure at the dam. He found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 20, underscore, underscore. She wanted to tell him, wanted to unburden herself of this terrible knowledge. But when she opened her mouth, she saw his face, tired, loyal, a man who followed rules and believed in the system. How could she drag him into this? Quote 21, quote, she said. Quote 22, quote. May came. The voices on line 54K continued. Cordelia kept listening, kept documenting, even though she no longer knew why. Nobody would listen. Nobody would help. But she couldn't stop, because stopping meant admitting that those children didn't matter, that their suffering was acceptable, that she could go on with her life while they cried in the wilderness. On May 15th, something changed. The call from line 54K was different. No children's voices in the background, just static and the hum of equipment. The man who answered wasn't Waverly, but someone else, speaking in clipped military tones. Quote, underscore, 23, quote. That was it. The line went dead. Cordelia sat frozen. Final report. Operations concluded. Assets transferred. Where had they transferred the children? What operations were concluded? She waited 3 days, hoping the line would activate again. It never did. On May 19th, when she checked the routing logs, line 54K was marked as deactivated. By the end of May, it was removed from the active directory entirely. Station 12 ceased to exist, at least in the communications network. June 3, 1944. Cordelia was called into the supervisor's office. Arnold Fletcher, a man she'd worked under for 6 years, looked uncomfortable. She knew immediately this wasn't about efficiency. Is this because of line 54K? Fletcher's face went carefully blank, but his eyes said otherwise. Cordelia went home that afternoon and told Vernon she'd been let go. He was angry, said he'd complained to the union. She stopped him. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 28, underscore, underscore. She didn't tell him why she really lost her job. That night, she took her notebook with all the recordings, the photographs of the files, and buried them in a metal box in the root cellar beneath their house. Someday, she thought, someday someone will want to know the truth. Summer 1944 passed. Cordelia found work at a canning factory, work that paid less and demanded more. Vernon was reassigned to a project in Wyoming, came home even less frequently. Their life contracted into a routine of survival and silence. She tried once more in August to get someone to listen. She went to the county sheriff, a man she'd known since childhood. Told him about the voices, the children, the closed facility. He listened politely, then patted her hand like she was senile. She never brought it up again. The war ended in 1945. The world celebrated. Cordelia watched the jubilation with a hollow feeling. Victory in Europe, victory in Japan, boys coming home. But what about those children? Where were they now? Had they been transferred to another facility, another secret location? Or had they been, quote, 30 along with the operations? Years passed. 1946, 1947, 1948. Cordelia and Vernon moved to a smaller town in eastern Montana, trying for a fresh start. She worked various jobs: store clerk, library assistant, bookkeeper. Never spoke about the war years, about what she'd heard on that classified line. Vernon died in 1952, heart attack while working on an irrigation project. Cordelia was 49 years old and alone. She continued working, continued living, but part of her had died with those children she couldn't save. In 1955, purely by accident, Cordelia met someone who changed everything. She was working at the county courthouse, filing property records, when an elderly man came in looking for information about his granddaughter. His name was Clement Theodore Ashford, and he was 73 years old, bent with age and grief. His granddaughter, he explained, had disappeared in 1943. Eleanor June Ashford, 7 years old. One day there, the next day, gone. The authorities said she'd been killed in an accident, hit by a truck on the highway, but there'd been no body. The casket at the funeral had been closed, sealed, and the family was told viewing wasn't possible due to the severity of injuries. I never believed it, Clement said. Eleanor was careful. She wouldn't have wandered near the highway. And when I demanded to see her body, 2 government men came to my house and told me to accept it and move on. Said it was for the best. Something in his story made Cordelia's blood run cold. Quote 33, quote, she asked. Quote 34, quote, Clement said. Quote 35, quote, the same period Station 12 was operational. Quote 36, quote, Cordelia said slowly. He looked at her strangely. Cordelia felt the room spin. 8 children. The same number she'd counted by voices on line 54K. Mr. Ashford, I need to tell you something. "You won't believe me, but I need you to listen." She told him everything. About the line, the voices, the crying, the lessons, the punishments. About how the facility was shut down in May 1944 and the line went dead. About how she'd tried to report it and lost her job. Clement listened with tears running down his weathered face. When she finished, he grabbed her hands. His voice broke. Cordelia whispered. They sat together in that courthouse office, two people bound by knowledge that the world wouldn't believe. Before he left, Clement pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "I've been collecting information for 12 years, every family I could find. 8 children, 8 families. I wrote their names down. If you ever find out what happened to them, if you ever learn the truth, promise me you'll tell their families. Promise me." Cordelia took the paper with shaking hands. "I promise. I'll keep this safe." Inside were 8 names, 8 birth dates, 8 hometowns. Eleanor June Ashford, born 1936, Helena. Calvin Ernest Merrick, born 1938, Great Falls. Josephine Pearl Donovan, born 1935, Billings. And 5 more. 8 children who vanished into the government's darkness. She kept that list for the rest of her life, moved it from house to house, kept it in the same metal box with her notebook and the photographs. She never stopped searching for answers, never stopped wondering. But the years passed and nothing surfaced. Station 12 remained a classified ghost, existing only in her memories and her hidden documents. In 1967, Cordelia was diagnosed with breast cancer. The doctors gave her a year, maybe 2 if she was lucky. She knew her time was running out, and with it, the knowledge of what she'd heard. She began writing everything down in detail, every memory of those months in 1944, every conversation, every sound she'd heard on that line. She wrote for hours each day, her handwriting growing shakier as the cancer spread. By 1968, she had a manuscript of nearly 200 pages. She didn't know what to do with it. No publisher would touch it. No newspaper would print it. It was too dangerous, too accusatory, too impossible to prove. Cordelia May Hutchins died on January 4, 1969, at the age of 65, just weeks shy of her 66th birthday. 2 weeks before her death, she gave the metal box to her neighbor's daughter, a college student named Patricia Holmes who was studying history. Cordelia told her. Patricia took the box, not fully understanding, and stored it in her attic. Station 12's location was declassified in 1978 as part of a routine document review. Researchers found it listed in archives as a wartime medical research facility, operational 1941 to 1944. No details about the research conducted, no personnel records, just coordinates: 47 degrees 52 minutes north latitude, 110 degrees 18 minutes west longitude. A journalist from Great Falls tried to visit the site in 1979. He found nothing. The wilderness had reclaimed it. No buildings, no foundations, no evidence anything had ever been there. In 1983, Patricia Holmes, now a professor of American history, was writing a book about Montana during World War II. She remembered the box Cordelia had given her 15 years earlier. She opened it, read the notebook, the manuscript, looked at the photographs. At first, she thought it was fiction, a conspiracy theory, but then she looked up the names on Clement Ashford's list. 8 children, all officially dead between January and April 1943. All buried in closed caskets. All families visited by government officials warning them not to investigate. Patricia spent 2 years researching. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests. She interviewed elderly War Department employees. She searched military archives. And slowly, impossibly, she found corroboration. In 1985, buried in declassified OSS documents, she found a memo. It referenced, quote, 49, quote, a classified program to study human endurance under extreme conditions. The memo mentioned, quote, 50, quote, and, quote, 51, quote. It mentioned Station 12 by name. More digging revealed more pieces. Project Fortitude had been established in 1941, ostensibly to research how soldiers could better withstand harsh conditions. But as the war progressed, the research expanded. They wanted to know how young bodies responded to cold, to limited rations, to isolation, to experimental vaccines and medications. The children, Patricia discovered, had been taken from orphanages and families deemed, quote, _52_poor, immigrant, Native American, families of dead soldiers. Their deaths had been faked. They'd been transferred to facilities like Station 12, where they became test subjects. The program ran until May 1944, when someone, the documents didn't say who, raised concerns about exposure. The facilities were hurriedly shut down. The children were transferred to a secondary location. Then, the records went blank. Patricia couldn't find what happened next. Some may have been returned to orphanages under false identities. Some may have died during the experiments. Some may have been permanently institutionalized to ensure silence. The truth had been buried too deep. Patricia published her findings in 1987 in an academic journal. The article was titled, Project Fortitude, America's Hidden Children, 1941 to 1944. It detailed everything she'd found, quoted extensively from Cordelia's manuscript, included Clement Ashford's list. The article caused a minor controversy in historical circles, but never reached mainstream attention. The government refused to comment. The families on the list were contacted, but most were dead or didn't want to reopen old wounds. In 1988, a small memorial was erected in Billings, Montana. 8 stones arranged in a circle, each engraved with one of the names from Clement's list. A plaque in the center read, quote, _54, quote. Below that, in smaller letters, __, quote, _55, __. Line 54. K was never reused after its decommissioning in May 1944. The number was retired from the routing system. But communications historians who've studied the old switchboard logs claim there's an anomaly. In recordings made of random call monitoring from 1944, recordings that were supposed to only capture the operator's switching actions, there are background noises. Faint, barely audible, but there. Children's voices. Crying. Whispers. __, quote, _56, __. Technically, this shouldn't be possible. The equipment didn't record ambient sound from the other end of the line. But multiple analysts have confirmed the sounds are there, embedded in the magnetic tape. The coordinates of Station 12, 47 degrees 52 minutes north latitude, 110 degrees 18 minutes west longitude. Today, it's empty grassland surrounded by pine forest, part of the Lewis and Clark National Forest. No trace remains of buildings or operations. Nature has erased it. But the earth remembers. And if you stand there on a quiet day, when the wind dies and the birds go silent, some say you can still hear echoes. Children's voices calling out from the past, asking when they can go home, asking where their mothers are. Voices that Cordelia May Hutchins heard 80 years ago and tried desperately to save, but couldn't. Voices that haunt the Montana wilderness still, waiting for someone to finally bring them justice. Or at least, to remember that they existed, that they suffered, and that one woman tried to help them when everyone else turned away.